And joining me now live from Riyadh is Igor Zhdanov. He is a correspondent with Russia Today. Igor, thank you so much for joining us. You're in Riyadh. Hectic parley is underway. Could these Riyadh talks really produce a breakthrough that many are hoping for?
Well, I have to say that the gravity of these talks is surely underlined by the very fact that they have been going on between the Russians and the Americans for over 6 hours. In fact, the groups, the delegations have had to take already 2 breaks. And so far, there is still no end in sight of these talks. So while they are happening behind closed doors and the media are not allowed in, it really is indicative as how both the Americans and the Russians are really treating the situation, that they really go deep into every detail. Otherwise, this meeting would have been already over. So there have been reports that after this round of talks is done and dusted, the Americans could go and meet with the Ukrainian delegation again, having already met with them yesterday. So really, it seems that the sides are sorting things out. And there has been some cautious optimism voiced by the Americans. The Russians have been rather tight-lipped about their expectations of the talks. For the Ukrainians, for that instance, they have not shared much detail as to what had been happening yesterday. But for when it comes to the Americans, they have been saying that they expect some real progress. And I mean, for everyone who is hoping for a ceasefire and for truce and eventually a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, they hope for the same thing. They hope for some, again, real progress.
Right. Igor, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, these are 4 territories that now are under Russian control or are part of Russian territories after the referendum in 2022. Now, will Russia really agree to cede land should the talks move forward, especially the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant?
Well, the issue of these territories, which Russia officially considers all these regions its own territory. And now with the new administration in power in Washington, they hear Russia's concerns. They hear Russia on this issue. And in fact, one of Donald Trump's special representatives and envoys recently in an interview to Tucker Carlson, a prominent American journalist, he has talked about this extensively, that Russia is in control, often not physically is in control of much of those territories, and that this is something that for Russia is very important, is very crucial, and the United States are hearing that, and it is obvious that they are bringing this up in their conversations with the Ukrainians. Now, of course, again, these conversations mostly happen behind closed doors. But so we have no way of knowing really as to what is being said there. But given the fact we can only use circumstantial evidence as to try and make up our minds as to what is being said there. But given that the Americans have been rather cautiously optimistic about it, what I can say is apparently the two sides are reaching towards the point in time when they find some common ground on these issues.
Right. Igor, Black Sea shipping lanes are also under discussion. Would Ukraine now be allowed to export grains again? We know that Russia had said that they would allow it.
Acceptable to Moscow, and Moscow has reiterated time and time again that this grain deal and the very issue of Ukraine exporting grain is not a red line for Moscow, but rather, the Kremlin, they did abandon the previous Green Deal, and that was over the accusation. Basically, it was about 2 things. First, the Russians, they accused Ukraine of exporting this grain in bulk and in huge masses, and while that grain was meant for poor nations, for those who have been hunger-stricken, who face famine, so really those whose population is in dire need of that grain. The Russians have accused Ukrainians of actually exporting their grain to Europe, to countries not very much in need, and abusing the terms of the grain deal. At the same time, the Russians have said that the Americans and the Europeans, they did not see and they did not fulfill their own end of the deal. They did not lift, or at least partially lift, sanctions on one of Russia's key banks to make the dealings, to make basically transactions when it comes to grain trade easier and to streamline that process. That was the reason why the Russians pulled out
Right.
of the first deal. So now with the second one, it is evident that Moscow doesn't want to repeat the same mistakes, really, and that they want guarantees that if the deal is in place, which Moscow is open for, then, well, both sides get something in return what was previously agreed
Right.
on.
Igor, you're in Riyadh. What's the role of Middle East in this entire process, or what we say called West Asia? Riyadh is hosting. President Putin spoke with the UAE leadership. What, according to you, is the role that they could play at a time when they themselves are faced with conflict?
Well, of course, there's no official version as to why Saudi Arabia has been chosen as sort of a middleman, or rather the grounds for the talks. The Middle East has played a big part in this Ukrainian conflict as a mediator. When you talk about United Arab Emirates, they have basically helped facilitate prisoners of war exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. This is something they've known to be doing. And President Putin has repeatedly expressed his gratitude. In fact, in the most recent phone conversation with the UAE leader, he has once again reiterated that Russia and he himself is thankful to Abu Dhabi for essentially playing such a big role. And Saudi Arabia is it has friendly relations with both Russia and Washington and Kiev, for that matter, too. So it does make sense that it is basically a non-partisan state that all sides in these talks see as a reliable partner.
Right. Igor Zhdanov, thank you so much for joining us here on the network. We'll keep coming back to you maybe to get a sense of what's happening on the ground since you're in Riyadh.